Welcome to this week's episode of Safe Room, your weekly source for horror gaming discussions and proudly part of Bloody Disgusting's Bloody FM podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Krieger.
And I'm Neil Bolt.
And this week we have a brand new feature, that being we're going to be chatting about our favorite openings or early levels of a horror game, and chatting about how those are sort of the outliers from more general, blandish, if you will, intros to horror games, things that have stuck out to us over the years. Before getting into some of our grab bag coverage, that being, I was playing some early 2000s junk food, that being F.E.A.R 3. Neil got to spend a little bit of time with a game that I love more than almost any other game, that being The Binding of Isaac, before he delves into a couple of 90s films of all things, that being, 90s films that depict sort of like VR and whatnot. And I didn't watch them in their entirety, but I got the gist of them from jumping around and whatnot between them. And Neil will certainly be able to tell us the aspects of those that maybe do right by that era of gaming, or how it maybe suffers or falls to the side. But before we get into those and more, Neil, how you doing this week?
Yeah, not too bad. Busy week with a cat in the house again for the first time in a long time. So it's been working around that and working with that.
Yeah, the unofficial, I'm sure, third chair co-host for the podcast at one point or another will make an appearance, which I'm sure that's made the household quite hectic.
Yes, yeah, and given she's very good at finding a way in places very quickly. One mistimed opening of a door could lead to just vaulting all around as we record, pressing all number of buttons.
Well, I'm sure you'll persevere in navigating that very, very hectic time in the household. But before we get into this week's feature of the week and our grab bag coverage, a bit of housekeeping. Please be sure to go back and listen to last week's installment of Horror Bites, which is Safe Room's indie horror bite-sized showcase, in which we'll be wrapping up our theme of aquatic horror. So we detail two more bite-sized aquatic horror games that tackle that subgenre in two very different ways. And while this current week, there's no new installment, be sure to check back next week for a new installment of Horror Bites that will be debuting an all-new, brand new theme, which we'll divulge during our regularly scheduled episode of Safe Room next Monday. But let's get right into our feature for this week, which is going to be, as I said, our favorite opening moments or levels of a horror game. For you, Neil, what's at the top of your list when you think about memorable beginnings to horror games, even if, that particular game maybe wouldn't go on to become one of your favorites, but it still had a memorable beginning, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the ones we're going to bring up, I'd imagine, are quite populist takes, and there's a good reason for that. It's because they are games that start strong. So I'll start with the one that probably isn't the standout in terms of games I don't like that much, I suppose, which is Resident Evil 3 Remake, which I think, in terms of its opening, does a fantastic sort of reimagining of that, in terms of how chaotic and relentless it feels, and before you really know the limitations of that game and the nemesis itself, it does just suddenly make you go, wow, you feel oh my god, I'm scrambling like that. You feel that fear, you feel that sort of tension, and the need to escape straight away. They do such a fantastic job of setting that pace and making you feel you and Jill feel under the cosh straight away. And it is a great illusion in much I suppose the same way that the original game had a great illusion with Nemesis, that he does feel like he'll be around every corner. He does feel he's going to pop up at every point. But obviously, the more you play it and the more you replay the game, you kind of get into the gist of it. But I do think everything up, probably until Carlos turns up, he's really well handled with Nemesis. And my favorite part of that whole thing is just with the car in the parking thing, where he just appears and you get that John Carpenter-esque stab of music, as he sort of walks towards you. It's it was like a culmination of the homages that we know from this series. You know, into like it felt very James Cameron, it felt very John Carpenter, like in that moment, and yeah, and it was the point originally playing it where I was like, oh man, this rocks. This is excellent stuff. Like this whole thing has felt like a proper relentless thing. There's another game we'll get onto later, which is similar in terms of like that, how it really just does not let up in its opening. But yeah, it's. I think the Resident Evil games in general, like I do have really strong openings, so that's not it's not uncommon. Even even a weaker game kind of has that. But yeah, I suppose you could say certain games don't, but yeah, it is like a common trend with this series, and I think that's the surprising thing about it is that even going back to it, knowing what I know about the game, it's still really strong. Like in that moment, just it doesn't quite have the same impact, but it is still like really well structured, really well sort of camera angles, everything like that. Just it's made to look fantastic in terms of being showing you what the story is, what you've got to do, what your threat is. Then yeah, shame about the rest of the game, but yeah, it's at least a good start.
Yeah, I think in keeping it in the realm of Resident Evil, if we're going to get some of our most memorable openings out of the way, I think for me, like, and as most people that have listened to any of our Resident Evil coverage know, like, I'm a huge proponent of Resi 4. And as soon as, and I think I said as much in our episode covering Resident Evil Requiem, immediately after finishing that, I went back and fired up Resident Evil 4 Remake. And, just once you get past the opening section where you finally get your gun, it's like that village assault, though, when you come to it and it's like, oh, the cop that you're looking for, one of them has already been dead. And now you find the other one and it's like, what do you know? He's being lit on fire by this mob of villagers, and just dealing with like the initial assault of being swarmed essentially in this very, it's a medium, I would say, or small open world in that, you've got about 6 or 7 of these buildings that you can basically seek refuge in. Each one of them has more than one entrance and exit to them. But still, like, it feels like this never ending wave of, especially in the harder difficulties when resources are much more limited, of these villagers that are attacking you. And for me, like, that captures that very much like classical horror movie feel of like, oh, okay, I'm facing these insurmountable odds. And, some games when you basically have to kind of like, oh, survive long enough until the elevator gets here. It's kind of like that sort of a framework. However, you don't have a timer or anything like that. So by the time, you get to the moment where that siege ends, you really do feel like you've been fighting and surviving by sort of the skin of your teeth. And what I think is really great about that sequence is that just as you think you found your first sort of reprieve from that onslaught, which is when you run into one particular building and you can shove a dresser in front of the door and you're like, oh, well, what are they going to be able to do? Then the chainsaw enemy comes out for the first time and you realize like, oh no, you have to keep moving. There is no safety in terms of this segment. And then you have to contend with him. And I think especially in going from playing naturally the original to then the remake, like one of the aspects of the remake version of that sequence that I love is that periodically when you pass through certain parts of that map and the chainsaw enemy is pursuing you, they will actually like sever beams to this basically like part of a building that caves in. And then you have one less route that you can take to escape the other enemies. And that moment itself was just like, holy shit, I forgot that was even a part of it when I replayed it this most recent time. And that kind of, again, further for me, it just like serves as an example of the importance of remakes in that, you can recreate sections from the original, but you can have these little touches that kind of like reinvigorate the tension or the terror, if you will, of those portions. So for me, that's probably my favorite opening to any Resident Evil game.
Yeah, and it's like, I think when you think of the original as well, like it's a great contextualizing of what's changed, for Resident Evil. It's like now you've got more freedom over the camera, and now the world is bigger, but everything has been made to match that, and change the threat. So now all that means is like, sure, you can see in front of you and to the side of you, and you can always check around you, but there are more ways that enemies can come at you, and
Yeah.
they have more humanities to them. They do more. They have more motor function, and they can pick up tools and all that. And yeah, it's in that short space. It really just tells you this is how this is different. This is how this game is. Yeah, very different to Resident Evil to that point, which, as I've gone on about before, is exactly why it was a bit rough for me at the time, because it was like, well, no, this doesn't feel like Resident Evil in the same way. But yeah, with age and maturity, you see that is the case. That he's showing you very quickly that, okay, this is what we're offering you. This is the kind of survival horror. And yeah, but at that point, we didn't really have many types of survival horror. And yeah, I think Resident Evil 4 ended up basically producing a whole bunch of games that would copy that formula and do it that way. Yeah, others, which I'm sure we'll mention, at least one. Yeah, it's a really good sort of way to reintroduce a series that has changed in so many ways fundamentally.
Yeah, that's a great point too, in terms of the changing of the type of gameplay that was featured there within. They really did kind of like build an opening that is wholly unique to that play style at the time for Resi. So that is a great sort of primer, as you said. Yeah. What else you got on your favorite game openings or opening levels?
Oh, let's go with the obvious ones out of the way, shall we? The Last of Us. I mean, it's just a really damn good opening. Like, I think in terms of atmosphere, in terms of tone, in terms of setting up the story, and giving you a real big gut puncher in such a short space of time, and how they arrive at that. I'm sure pretty much everyone who wants to play the game has played it at this point, this thing, and the whole thing of playing as Sarah, the daughter, in that section, like where everything's hunky dory and there's no real sign of anything going wrong, and then waking up later to it being dark and the TV static and Joel's not home and all that stuff, and like just the little hints that something's wrong, and just like that general sense of unease, to everything that then comes after. Every little mini explosion of something's going on, and then something bigger goes on, like the guy smashing through the window, and then to their car journey, and as they just see stuff happening out the back. And I think giving you control as Sarah is so important in that opening as well, for that, in terms of how it puts you in a certain place for what's going on, in not understanding what's going on, about the vulnerability you feel. And yeah, and then it's obviously like when you get to be Joel and running through the streets, and like just the absolute madness of it, stuff that Resident Evil 2 and 3 did, in terms of just like capturing like this place has gone to hell. Obviously at this point we're more uninfected people. And yeah, it's just Naughty Dog great at doing showcase stuff anyway, in openings and especially. And yeah, I thought it was just phenomenal stuff. And like I said, right through to the end of like what happens with Sarah, and like the time jump. Then I was like, just giving it a nice, perfect opening to say, this is what happened in the world, and now we're going to fast forward, sort of thing. And yeah, it just gives you everything you need to know about Joel, in terms of like what he's gone through, where he is in the world now, and like they very quickly establish that. Yeah, that initial part with the with the prologue, if you will, is never really loses anything. I think it's even with each, like even with like the remake master thing they did, that looked better. It was like they still kept it. They still kept everything that made it feel uneasy in those opening moments. Like, even though nothing's going to happen to a scripted point, it just feels like it, and it's that feeling of just like being young, alone in your home at night, and wondering where everyone is, and things not seeming quite right. And yeah, it's going then into something actually going wrong, and it being escalating the way it does. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's one of those things that always makes me think of Amnesia Rebirth, right? The
Mm.
fact that you have those openings that can be quite manipulative in a way, right? With The Last of Us,
Yeah,
it being you're going to play as daughter of the protagonist, and naturally, we all know how her fate turns out, which further informs, um, Joel and who his character is. And there really is no better way to make you understand who he is, and basically when things are alluded to later on in the game about what he may have done or definitely did, you more or less like understand it while not
yeah,
justifying it necessarily. But like that speaks to the notion of like complex characters that you can root for, despite the fact that they may have done these horrible things, but at least they, in that instance, maybe are like informed by something and it's not vague or whatnot. It's like the player has definitive proof for why he's done the things that he's done and why he is the way that he
mm.
is. Again, you don't have to send them, but it is the type of thing where you at least you can understand how he became this potential monster or whatnot. And likewise, in like Amnesia Rebirth, you being a character that is with child, right? That kind of like again builds this level of sympathy for a character that you don't really know until a certain
Mm.
point, but at the same time, you still, the notion of kids and parents in games is one that I think those are probably the two best examples of them, the utilization of that narratively speaking.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
so,
yeah, Rebirth's a good shout. Like it's yeah, even though it does a few things that a few horror games kind of intro with, like your plane crashes into a
mhm.
place and like stuff. We've seen that in Bioshock. We've seen it in the forest, things like that. But yeah, it's effective.
Hmm.
It's and yeah, I think that's a great point. About using manipulating things with that and using children to gain sort of empathy for a character in that way. Um, Obviously, like in any media, people will take that different ways and not really get the context of why it doesn't matter in a way, I suppose. But in terms of justifying what the character then goes on to do, sort of thing. But yeah, that's a whole other debate that we've partially had, I think, in talking about The Last of Us before. So, but what else did you sort of want to bring up with this one?
Yeah, for me, next I would say Bioshock is a
Mm.
massive one for me. The whole opening section of the plane crash, and then you're basically welcome to Rapture.
Yeah.
Um, I just as early as this week decided to reinstall that and just kind of like play the first hour or two in between some other things I was playing. And yeah, that still is a fantastic primer that really, I think, reinforces the mystery aspect of what makes the original Bioshock so strong. And even all these years later, and that, you go from this plane crash landing in the ocean. And when you do that sort of pivot with your perspective, and all of a sudden you see this lighthouse, which would go on to become a pretty core image of
Mm.
the game, and thematic imagery at that. But like it's even past that, the sort of like awe-inspiring nature of that, of now you're descending essentially 20,000 leagues under the sea to this underwater city, but you have that bathysphere ride and it shows you the various industries that are underneath the ocean and everything. But it goes further than that even for me, and it's like you get a real primer for like this being a lived in space. It's not so much just the sort of like haunted house underwater, if you will. It's like, no, outside of even the fact that there are splicers and obviously there are a couple of human survivors still down there, like it feels like a place that has a real history. And I think that
Yeah.
comes across in the sort of like adverts that you see. You get to see that in the bathysphere itself. You see like advertisements for plasmids and whatnot. But also you can see once you start walking around that bathysphere, sort of like train station esque, if you will. You get to see like people's luggage that's been discarded. You get to see a lot of signs that are indicative of the revolt that was going on before
Mm.
bathysphere travel was outright canceled. Um, but on top of that, also like you get to see early on two splicers that are basically like having an argument or fighting about Adam, and it's portrayed as like a domestic situation almost,
Yeah.
and like that aspect, I think when you contrast it against like the elements of that world that were present before, Rapture goes to hell and becomes basically the most expensive, largest sinking toilet or leaking toilet at that. You see that, like, oh, okay, in the fact that society has essentially ended doesn't mean that a new society is not going to crop up in its absence. And I think that kind of just shows you that this is this ever sort of like revolving door of societies being established and sort of like falling apart, but nonetheless, like in the stay of normal society, this new like apocalyptic one has cropped up, and I just still think that it's a very affecting opening hour of that game that just like reinforces the mystery and that sense of space all the way to that unfortunate boss fight section at the very end of it. But I think that's ultimately the best strength of that game is just that sense of space.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. It's yeah, we were just talking about it before in terms of like the plane crashes and things like that. And yeah, I mean, I also quite, I know it gets shat on a lot these days, but I think Infinite's opening is pretty good too, just in terms of like tend of building stuff up. But sure, it maybe gets a bit like on the nose, yeah, in terms of where it goes with it and clunky, and the fact we'd seen a lot of it before, and it's a game that's kind of further removed from the inspirations of this series. But yeah, I think it's a series that has just pretty strong openings, to be fair, in general. So set up by, as you said, that first one being as damn good as it is.
Oh, before moving on, like I think that's a great example also of the opening to Infinite with the introduction of Columbia. Like that, I think is sort of I don't know, like a redux of what worked so well with the original Bioshock. But in that specific instance, that works the same, I think, in terms of if you were a new player coming to Infinite, you don't have that history with Bioshock 1 or 2. But at the same time, even fans of the franchise, like there's enough there that is familiar in terms of, the utilization of the lighthouse and whatnot. But at the same time, you're able to rival that wonderment that was felt in going to Rapture for the first time with Columbia, because some elements are similar, but at the same time, you get to explore society that is on the cusp of the powder keg that would, explode within minutes of you being there. But you get to see what that society is like in the sort of like perceived idyllicness of it before it all goes to hell and collapses, which I think was a nice contrast to what worked so well with the original Bioshock.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose loosely keeping on those sort of themes of, well, in more the ImSim inspired crowd, Prey is always going to be in there for me, which is surprising because I think with that game, the demo gave away the twist. Like a lot of the previews did that as well. But I do think the structure of that twist, as much as I think that was mishandled, going into that with that weird point with Bethesda, that they didn't quite know how to handle things in the press and decided, yeah, we'll just let this game not get reviewed, or we'll just give away like a massive twist in this game, like in our preview footage, like for shits and giggles. But all the same, I think it's a classic structure thing. The whole going through the cycle at the beginning of like doing the work day, going through the testing, coming out the other end, something bad happening like at the end of it, then you get gassed and waking up and it's the same all over again. But now you have the knowledge that something else is a bit off and the situation is quite the same. Your room is seemingly the same, but everything outside it is wrong. And then of course you have that thing of like find a way to escape and like figuring out that you can smash the window and it revealing like the skyline outside your room is not real, and that you're in some sort of facility, and then to go beyond that and then have the double reveal that you are not only not in an apartment on Earth, but you are on a fucking base in a space station, and seeing like the moon outside is like a really strong way of just like introducing that world and giving you a nice little bit of mystery You get a little bit the horror of what's going on, but never being entirely sure what's going on. But the first thing you know, of course, is like the mimics and the fact they can turn into objects, and how you suddenly can't trust anything you see around you from the off. And yeah, it's just in very much the same vein as those sort of games that came before, just like the Shock series. It's great storytelling, through world building at the same time. Like you're getting everything. Like the way the world is designed is telling you the story as much as like anything you're interacting with in it. And yeah, it just gives you such a sense of place. And I think in terms of both games, it's the world that does it. Like it's a world that you're like curious about from the off. And you're like, okay, so I'm on a space station that isn't a space station. Like we didn't realize it was like I don't really, we thought we were in some sort of facility, thought we were on Earth before that, and yeah, it's just the weirdness of it and all the unexplained stuff and just the way it goes. But in that opening, just to give you that sort of double revelation sort of thing, well, triple, I suppose, in terms of like the introduction of the Titan as well. But yeah, it is. But nothing. It doesn't feel like over the top to go that far. It's really well done, and just like the mythology that's been built up about that, in terms of like everything you can see afterwards of like how the game manipulates you into thinking this, that, and the other. Like, well, what about the helicopter ride? Oh, but what about the elevators? And oh, what about this and that? And you realize, that it was just all like simulation. And yeah, God, so well done. And like I said, one of the best ways to sort of set you in your place of like, I don't know who I am really, I don't know where I am really, I don't know why I'm here really, sort of thing, which is like the perfect soup for that kind of game, like where you just are left with too much mystery and end up diving into things well ahead of where you should when you haven't got all the information.
Yeah, that intro is phenomenal, and you beat me to it. It's on my list, so I might have to talk about Prey 2006, the original, in a minute. But I think like that breaking through the Matrix bit is, despite the fact that it was ruined by the coverage and the demo itself and whatnot. But like, I think that moment in and of itself is fantastic. But what really sells that for me in a way that made me like paranoid about what to believe and what not to believe for the remainder of that game was the fact that you can see afterwards the facade of the building, the helicopter ride, as you mentioned, also like the office that you have to walk through when you meet your brother for the first time. Like those aspects of it, I think really did make me view a majority of the world for the first, third of the game or so with this notion of like, can I believe what I'm actually seeing? And I think that, while maybe it doesn't have another moment that lives up to that initial paranoia in the opening of the game, like that still is a perfect primer for overall what this game is going for, and still serves, I think, for like the notion that just because you're rebooting a series doesn't mean that you can't do something that's completely foreign to the original. You can play around with certain aspects, perhaps, or, even if it's very loose like it is here, like, yeah, you're in space, there's aliens, but that's really all that there is in terms of connectivity tissue between this and the original Prey. But, as we've chatted about at length on the podcast, especially when we had Aaron on for that episode years ago at this point, like it is such a phenomenal game that rewrites the sort of like remake playbook in a way that none of us saw coming. And as I said as much in our initial episode, it was a remake that I had to play more than once for it to really click with me. Because initially it didn't. And then once I sort of like was able to grasp what we were going for here, it kind of just like opened up my eyes to the genius of this remake. And furthermore, like how you can expand that with roguelite elements in Moon Crash or Moonfall.
Crash,
yeah, Moon Crash. It's just tremendous. And I guess along those same lines, like the original Prey, even if, for what you can say about the original, it more or less kind of just feels like a straightforward enough corridor shooter that has some sci-fi elements to it. I think that opening is fantastic, right? It really does feel like Close Encounters of the Third Kind or Fire in the Sky, right? The abduction aspect of it. I think that whole aspect is so well presented, and is like, you know, that that's where you're headed essentially, but it feels a little shocking in the moment because of how suddenly it comes upon. It doesn't play out in a cutscene; it plays out in real time. When the player has
Mm.
been immersed in that world, you get to know the important people, and then it is on the cusp of a act of violence. So it's one of those things that like is kind of pulls the rug out from under you. So in that regard, again, further, it's just such a smart rebranding on Fear and whatnot, or I pray rather.
Yeah, I I've still yet to get to that one for some reason. So, but
Yeah.
yeah, like I mean, that whole situation with those games was silly anyway. The fact that
Mm.
training got kind of foused upon like Arcane as well, which kind of gave them this enviable task of, oh, okay, well now the people who like the original Prey are going to be pissed off at you for remaking a game that you haven't technically remade, sort of thing. Like, but yeah, I think both should be able to exist in their own ways. It's just a weird thing. But to be honest, Hollywood does a lot anyway. Like we'll use a name, but we won't
Mm.
really make it the same thing, sort of thing. But use the name for whatever it might get us, sort of thing. But yeah, definitely got to go back and play that game, the original.
Well, you'll have to make some time for that in the next few months because apparently, according to Wikipedia,
Mm,
Prey's 20th anniversary is in July.
yeah, not far
So
off.
we might have to make some time for that coming up.
Absolutely. I think it's available still, so
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
or something. So
I got it on Xbox Live, I think, last summer for like $5 or something like that. So yeah, it
yeah,
goes on sale periodically.
yeah, I think I'd rebought it as well, the same way. So,
There you go.
but yeah, we got next. Let's see. Um, yeah, I mean, they're just going to get more and more unoriginal. But well, I've alluded to it a few times, and when I was thinking, had we covered all this stuff before, I was thinking it's because we talked about certain openings
Mm,
at length, and Dead Space 2's opening is
yep.
like still one of my favorites of any
Mm,
horror game. I think just in because that game is just built on like the madness of it all and like how brutal and mean everything is, and just that whole outbreak opening, the whole hallucination into outbreak bit with Isaac, and just like having to run around in a straitjacket. Yeah, and then just gradually getting your stuff back as you go along. It's kind of like the inverse of what a lot of sequels do, where it's just like, all the stuff you had in the first game, you get it for the beginning, and then it's all taken away from you, sort of thing. Here it's just like, no, you got fuck all, and
mm,
you've got less than you had the first time around, sort of
mm,
thing. And this time you have the knowledge of what's going on. It's worse, but you have even less you can do about it, sort of thing. And so, yeah, it just makes those early encounters just feel so, intense, even in
mm,
returning to it, because you have no real way of getting around it. And I think it was a smart move, really, around that time when, before we really got that many games that were doing that in the indie space,
mm,
of having, like horror games where you don't really have like anything to protect yourself properly, like that, like traditional weapons sort of thing, and that feeling of hopelessness. And for a survival horror game, which is already about like limited ammo or like threats being like instant death and stuff, it was a different way around it,
mm,
and I quite enjoyed that. Compared to what we could have done with it, and been a bit more action heavy maybe, but in terms of just like going blasting. No, I like that you get this sort of relentless, bleak return to this world, and you kind of have to endure torturous time of like getting back to what you were like, and it makes getting Isaac's suit back like all the more satisfying. Like then you suddenly feel okay, so now I'm ready for what this
mm,
new wave of this can throw at me, and then the game goes, well, there's going to be more stuff. So yeah, it will get worse, sort of thing. But
mm,
it is amazing how how comforting it feels in that moment to like finally get a suit back on you, and just
mm,
because you feel a vulnerability that isn't there necessarily in the first game as much, because you have that suit, and
mm,
it feels compared to like most characters in survival horror games where they are, while they might have some light armor to themselves, they are generally quite fleshy and vulnerable. And I suppose with a foe that can kind of penetrate that anyway, it shouldn't feel so comforting, but it does. It's like, well, you feel like you can withstand a bit more damage. But like I said, in those opening moments where you are just, you have nothing, you can't really move your arms, can't do much at all. Yeah, it's just fantastically paced. I'm saying fantastic a lot, but these are all fantastic, so that's why. But yeah, it just goes along nicely and really stands the test of time.
I think also what I appreciate the most about the Dead Space 2 intro is the fact that it doesn't waste a lot of time, I think, in getting you into the thick of things, which benefits both, players that are coming back after playing the original, but also it still feels very accessible to newcomers. And it gets you into sort of the mix, if you will, a lot quicker than the buildup that's in the original. And that's not a commentary on like how I feel like the setup for the original is. I think it's phenomenal, as we talked about when we covered the remake, but just more importantly, like, you have to think about this era when the original Dead Space like came out of nowhere. People didn't have obviously a great deal of knowledge about what that entailed. And so some people are going to pick up the sequel. And if anything, that would make me want to go back then and replay the original because you can get even more context for what's happening. But the sequel, rather, I still felt did a great job of like getting you into the action, letting you see why this series is so revered. But at the same time, you get to still have enough context that it's like you're not completely lost. And I think that a lot of like early aughts getting into the 2010s sort of sequels, the late stage, I suppose, of the early aughts was when developers started to realize that. They realized that like, okay, if you're going to make sequels, you don't have to have, 10 minutes of cutscenes that kind of like are filling in all the gaps. You give people enough to work with. Then once they get into that, they're going to see why this series is so special. And then, of course, you can go back and replay the original. But I think that to your point, though, also that vulnerability at the very beginning of Dead Space 2 is something that, like, again, puts even veterans for the series on their back foot, so to speak, initially. And then you get back in that suit and you get that sense of, maybe it's misplaced, but that sense of safety, right, with the suit. Because if anything, as we've talked about, the intensity of the sequel ratchets up in a huge way. But I think that overall, like, that is such a strong opening because it, again, even for people that played the original, it makes it terrifying in a way that wasn't there in the original, that vulnerability. And, we talked about, I think it was late last year, middle point of last year, we were talking about the second game and for an anniversary and just like how strong of a sequel that was for so many different reasons.
Yeah, it's still bloody grand as games get.
Yes, in terms of keeping things in the realm of sequels, like just a brief thing, one of my favorite openings to any sequel is the one for, as you'll be shocked to learn, Half-Life 2. I think the opening there, you're able to build upon the legacy of the opening of the original Half-Life, which naturally introduced people to the notion that games stories could be presented in a much more cinematic fashion. It's the original Gordon Freeman. He's fucking taking the train to work. Like, it doesn't get any more on paper mundane sounding than that. But however, that opened up this whole notion of like, storytelling in film could be utilized for storytelling in games. And for the sequel to, return to those roots, it's a train ride, but to really like condense the events of the original Half-Life into that, what is essentially a 45, 60-second opening of Half-Life 2, giving them players enough context because, Half-Life 2 came out on consoles. It was also on Steam. So you're getting a whole audience and generation of people that maybe aren't familiar with the original game, such as myself. Like, I played Half-Life 2 before Half-Life 1, but I never felt that I was like lost in terms of the narrative or what is happening. It's like, I always felt that intro was such a succinct and concise, like, summation of the original game that, if anything, it made me want to go back and learn all the little details. Oh, I want to know more about Barry. I want to know more about Gordon's tenure at Black Mesa. I I want to learn more about Dr. Klein and his relation to, the 7 Hour War and Black Mesa and all this and that. But like, I just think that Half-Life 2 still remains such a masterclass in terms of an opening. And as we've said at length at this point, like why that's such a phenomenal sequel. And I think that it does just a great job of, again, summarizing while not bogging down and really getting you into the aspects of Half-Life that make it such a phenomenal first-person shooter series.
Yeah, I mean, I think Valve's done a few damn good openings over the years, and yeah, Half-Life 2 is just one of those where, especially considering, because I was going to bring up the first game as well, so like considering that first game has like the most memorable sort of openings because of basically how long it takes and how long it draws it out and how it lets you. Yeah, we were just saying it about like The Last of Us and that bit in the car where you're just sort of viewing everything that's going on as you go by. And this is like the mundane version of that, where you are just sort of seeing the everyday of Black Mesa as you go around like that. And it's basically a long, like, what would you call it? Like an amusement park kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you're just on rails, going through, seeing stuff, but it works, and you could technically say that opening in that game still leads to all the way through to everything that happens with the whole fuckery that goes on with the machine.
Yeah.
But yeah, like for Half-Life 2 to then just come and revisit that in a different way, but still and introduce you to a new world effectively and a new idea of things, where you are suddenly like thrust into a situation that you are not familiar with from the start, compared to Black Mesa, where it's like you're going in, it's another day, blah blah blah, sort of work, and then everything goes wrong. Yeah, here where you are just sort of suddenly here in this new place, and you're trying to understand the rules of it, and it's quickly showing you, the storytelling tools there without the use of cutscenes that just so many games have failed to interpret since. And I get it because I'm sure there are lots of things that tell developers and publishers that, oh well, you want to keep people's attention and make sure they're invested in what's going on, and it's better that they don't have control in this moment, maybe. So they take in the story better instead of looking behind them at whatever's on the floor or something. But yeah, there is just like a certain quality to really framing something like that, really making it work, and without feeling like you're too on rails like that. And
Yeah.
it's such a smart way of going about it, and introducing you to the world, introducing you to the rules of this world and what you can get in it. Yeah, it's a game that almost feels like an opening of an opening of an opening of an opening, where you just get these little introductory stages to a new thing, and it's like, oh, okay, this feels fresh and new again. And there's a reason why Half-Life 2 is as good as it is you just keep getting that feeling over and over again of like, oh, this is fresh, this is new, I'm in a new place, and you feel the chapters in a way that feels exciting, like that. They're connected, but they are so different, and there's always a different challenge to it, and which is why I think stuff like Ravenholm kind of stands out, because it feels distinct when you go there like that. And again, it's just one of those surprises that you get that, oh my god, this is so intense and different. And yeah, we can't help but mention Ravenholm again, but yeah, but that it's just the Half-Life games, I think, just have fantastic openings. And Portal 2, I would say, the original Portal was more of a slow burn to get there, but I think Portal 2 is also just very good at doing that too. And the Left 4 Dead games, well, they're not really the same kind of way of doing, but they are very quick to introduce you to that world once you're in the levels of it. But yeah, Half-Life 2 and Half-Life, I think, are always sound choices.
Well, I think it needs to be mentioned, since you just invoked the name of Portal 2. Like, that's a game that I have yet to play more than an hour or so of, and that game has its, I believe, 15th anniversary this month. So who's
My
to say
God,
I won't make some time for that soon so we can chat about it, because you've been pumping that one for me for a long time.
oh man, like yeah, like that's as an aside, like probably one of the greatest games ever made. Like,
Hmm.
but yeah, just yeah, one of those games where it's like if it comes out on something, like yep, I'll play that and I'll play that again. So even on Switch, I didn't really play much in terms of games. It was like Portal 2 on a handheld, yes please, sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Well, that's just got moved up my list yet again. So I feel like that's just like the story of my life the last 2 years. It's like we have these asides, and then it's like, oh, okay, cool. I need to play this, and that, and then
Yeah.
it's a good problem to have. I don't even know I'd classify it as a problem, but good trend.
Only in time. Only in
Yeah.
time is it a problem.
Um, I guess the only other thing I had on my list that we haven't touched upon, unless you had more, was
No.
going to be Doom 2016, the reboot. I think that is probably one of the best, more modern. Well, at this point, modern. It's fucking 10 years old at this point, but it's one of those things where it's like I thought that was such a fantastic
Yeah.
reboot, because of the fact that it's able to usher in this new approach to Doom, while at the same
Mm.
time it is able to be reflective of its own history and not take itself too seriously, which I think is, one of my biggest pet peeves, with games, is that when they start to like drink their own Kool-Aid, essentially,
Mm.
things that take themselves too seriously. It's like Doom has always been about black metal and demon killing, but that doesn't mean that it's the type of thing that you should, like, there's Doom lore and all these things that the reboot goes into, but it's so firmly tongue in cheek, and there's a real humor that is evident from just that very opening. That I think it again is like indicative of a studio that understands what they do well, but they are still not willing to like, so again, like, drink their own Kool Aid. And I think there's no stronger example of that than in how that opening segment ends, when you get on the elevator and the Doom Marine or Doom guy is listening to Samuel Hayden, the new antagonist, and he's talking about the cost of what the UAC's been doing, and the
Yeah.
loss of life, and how it's worth it. And then Doom guy, naturally, without saying anything, he like looks down in the elevator, and there's a human corpse there with like no head, or it's been
Mm.
eviscerated basically. And Samuel Hayden's like, yeah, and it was worth the cost. And then he basically like puts his fist through the communication device just as the Doom music, like Neil Gordon's score, kicks in, and it's just like this badass metal score. And it's one of those things where you're just like, yeah, Doom is back. It's back in a big way, in a bloody way, but at the same time, like, the computer monitors are able to gauge like the level of demonic incursion or invasion and stuff, and it's just like it's so perfect in my opinion. And I think, again, like, reset the sort of like standard for reboots in a way that hadn't necessarily been done. Like, we talk
Yeah.
about Resident Evil 2 in terms of remakes, and how that's like the blueprint in one way. But I think that in terms of rebooting a franchise that had been dormant for a long while, Doom 2016, I think, is at the top of my list. And a big part of that has to do with that score, which just fucking still rips and tears all these years later. But I just love it.
I love the Mick Gordon score
Yeah.
always. Yeah, it's definitely that golden period of
Mm.
Bethesda, and it's especially I think where it just I think when did they get taken over? I was like I think
Oh,
when it was.
jeez.
It's, was that just before?
I believe
But,
so.
but yeah, it was a good period of time, even though they were struggling to sort of understand what to do with themselves. And Doom, I think, being a great example where they did kind of feel like they're a bit underconfident about what's going on with it.
Mm.
And, the whole thing about the no reviews at launch and no review code till the game had come out, sort of thing, and which just looked bizarre. Then when it did come out, it was good. I do think that kind of played into why it became popular, because it felt more like a surprise in that way. But yeah, it's yeah, it's a great way to sort of reimagine things and gives it that sort of lick of humor that was not really there before in that series. I think Doom 2016, as we probably mentioned before, it begs, steals, and borrows from so many different things over the years in first-person shooter history, which is fair. I think if anyone can do that, it's because they've earned that right to take back what was taken from them, sort of thing. And yeah, I think that's what makes it such a successful reboot, is that it just goes, yeah, these are the people that made great first-person shooters, and now they're coming back and with almost a celebration of what has been in that time. And yeah, from the opening, it kind of gives you that.
Oh, absolutely. And furthermore, again, this feels like half episode, half business meeting, but Doom 2016's 10th anniversary is just next month. So again, might have to revisit that one myself and see if we can drum up some new conversation about that one, because still I think that is such a fantastic example of a reboot that I think goes leaps and bounds above the call of the notion of rebooting. Again, like arguably the biggest game ever made, and doing so in a fashion that just like is so forward thinking while still reflective of a series' entire history. So still, I think when that originally came out, I probably played that a half dozen times over the 2 years since it was released, because it was just so phenomenal and exactly the type of thing I wanted. But
That makes sense.
Yeah,
it was 2021. That was when the takeover was. So it was well before that. So.
Okay, well before. Trying to juggle all these dates can sometimes be a lot, but that's why I got you around, Neil. But yeah, I think unless you had anything else, why don't we take a quick break and then we can dive right into our grab bag coverage for the month.
Yeah, just a weird
For the
aside
week.
though. It's like, that's it. Yeah, no, just a weird aside that came up was we were talking, given that you were talking about the original Prey. It's like Scott Miller at 3D Realms and Apogee just was talking about the use of "Don't Fear the Reaper" in that, and saying that it cost about 10K to license it in 2006, and today to license that same song it's 150K. So like,
oh my God! Well, alongside the price of groceries and gas, at least over here in the States, everything's going up.
Yeah, I thought it must be cheap, the amount of things you hear it in. There you go.
For real. Well, again, that's a game that I'm hopeful we'll get to revisit in the near future for that anniversary, because as it will shock you and everyone listening, I did not end up finishing that one. I got a few hours into it and then got distracted. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity, hopefully coming up, to finish that, because as anybody that's played that, there's a lot that I think is unique about that in the opening moments, but at the same time, there's some aspects of it that maybe haven't aged the best. But like I said, we'll be able to dig into that hopefully pretty soon. But yeah, we're going to take that break, and then we'll come back and dive right into our grab bag for game and movie coverage for this week. But more on that in a moment. And we're back from our break. And Neil, why don't I kick it to you? What did you play so far this week? And then I'll dive into what I played this week, and then we'll get into the movie side of things to round us out.
So yeah, I won't spend a huge amount of time on this because there's not too much to say so far. But yeah, as we've been talking about a few times in recent weeks, The Binding of Isaac was like one of those things that I keep coming back to, playing a few hours of, and like not really getting into a groove of things. Like, I guess, like, that sometimes with these games that you hear so much about, you play them for a bit, you don't really quickly understand what you're supposed to be doing sometimes, and like you kind of don't get to the meat of it, where it's go, oh, okay, I see, sort of thing, like that, and understanding all the things behind it as much as you can. yeah, I kind of got to that point, I think, this week where I just had to play something that was short and sharp-ish. He says, like last night, going, I'll have an early night tonight, and then going on a run that was like long enough to finish and the run, yeah, I think also that and the complexity of like all the DLCs and well, you need this one for this stuff and this one for that, but don't buy this one if you haven't got this one. And
Yeah.
it's like, it's just baffling like that. And the fact that, I mean, on Steam, I have like the whole game, like all the stuff. I don't remember buying all that, but I did apparently.
That's how Steam libraries work. You should know that.
Yeah, that's it. But I was playing it on PS4, PS5, if you will, and which I've only got like the first bunch of DLC for. But yeah, just like getting the rhythm of that and runs of it. I'm just always fascinated by the idea behind it and just how dark it is, and just like all the powers and how and abilities are just these weirdo things. I mean, from what you've played in Eugenics, it's kind of like a continuation of that, isn't it? Where you are basically just, these things are fucked up, but hey, they've got great abilities that come from that, and let's just keep making these things fucked up and terrible, so they can do wonderful things in the context of this, situation. With Isaac, just the whole, this poor put upon child, like being tormented in this way, and just, I mean, even if you don't read into it too much, just like the intention of what it's saying, in terms of him going down into these dungeons and fighting all these creatures, his offspring, effectively, with his tears and stuff, and it's demented, and it's one of those great examples of like it's just wild as a concept that really you'd think it would be controversial a bit more than it is.
Yeah.
But instead it's just very popular because the underlying game is so compelling, and so engrossing when you get, because it's got that one more run quality, hasn't it? Where you just, like, okay, so that one wasn't very good, but another run is like a button press away, and you can maybe this run you'll get something good happen like straight away, and it's got those beautiful roguelike qualities of just like picking up certain items and objects on a run and going, okay, I can make this work, I can make that work. And as you understand each thing more, like there's so much mystery about everything because it's not explained very well at all, which is obviously intentional. But that's the cool thing about it, because you don't tend to deviate in these early hours towards any one particular thing because you don't have that choice. So instead, you just take what you get and you work with it. Sometimes it's a curse, sometimes a gift, sort of thing. Like you'll think, okay, if I could get these things and I'll get these bosses, it'd be great. But of course, the game will throw what it throws at you, and it's unrelentingly bleak. And yeah, I've just really enjoyed getting into that world again, and like I think it's the thing that keeps me coming back. Same like stuff like Bloodborne, where I think I really appreciate the world and the design of everything and the story behind it. But with that game, it's like I bounce off it compared to other From Software games, and with this, it's always been like I like what it's going for. I just don't know if I'm seeing the full value with it, sort of thing. But it really does feel like I kind of clicked into that place.
I think that my favorite aspect of The Binding of Isaac is that notion that you touched upon briefly there, where it was like, yeah, I just finished a run. This game does not tell you a great deal right out the gate or provide much context at all. But each time that you have a run, basically, no matter how good it is or how poorly it goes, you are more or less learning something. And naturally, that requires the player to be willing to experiment. And I think that for me, like that's one of the strongest aspects in that experimentation, even if it ends up resulting in utter defeat or death, you are still learning something that informs how the next playthrough and subsequent playthroughs are going to go. And I love that aspect because of the fact that, you're constantly learning, you're constantly evolving. And I think that makes it a game where it's like, yeah, initially I was kind of like, I have no fucking clue what this does or that does. And might have been met with a little bit of frustration, but the more that you stick with this game, the more that you see the value in trying things. Because, like you said, the next run is just a single click away, and you jump right back into the thick of things. And if anything, it just strengthens every subsequent playthrough. So I'm glad that you were able to make some time for this one. Because, as I said as much in our Desert Island episode, this is one of my absolute favorite games, and there is some of that identity there in eugenics, which once you have some time to spend more time with that game, I would love to chat about that in some depth with you, because as I told you before we were recording, like I think I've got up to now about 35 or 40 hours with that, and it really is a game that I just can't quit for many reasons that are familiar to Binding of Isaac, despite the fact you've gone from live action arcadey style game to something turn based, but there's a lot of connectivity tissue there. Yeah.
Yeah. There wasn't much more I could say about it, because it's just I don't have enough detail, I suppose, in what that. And yeah, I'm sure anyone who's ever played Isaac and to any length of time will go, "Yep, that sounds like Isaac," and that's good, I suppose. What about you, man?
Absolutely.
What have you played? What have you played this week?
Yeah, this week I didn't play a whole lot that was new outside of Mugenics, but I did have some time and was in the mood for some early aughts junk food. I was browsing the Xbox Live marketplace and saw that F.E.A.R 3 was on sale. It was its usual sale price of like $5, and I happen to have $5 worth of credit on there, so I was like, "Fuck it, I need a 6 to 8 hour straightforward corridor shooter. Don't have to think much about it." John Carpenter directed, I believe, the cutscenes for it, so I might as well see what that looks like after playing, Toxic Commando. And it was basically exactly what I thought it'd be. It was, I think, better than the second F.E.A.R game, which is not saying a whole lot, but I think that what it does is it retains that very primal sort of punchy weapon slow-mo feedback that everyone is used to and is a fan of if you've enjoyed the original F.E.A.R game or the sequels and standalone expansions and whatnot. That formula is relatively unchanged. And the most interesting aspect, I think, here is the fact that both in single player and in multiplayer, which that's a first for this series in terms of cooperative multiplayer, that you can play as Paxton Fettel, who has been the series antagonist. So if you're playing in co-op, you play as the point man, or one person plays as point man, the other person plays as Paxton Fettel. Paxton Fettel does not use traditional firearms. So he has these, like, whatever you want to call them, astral magical abilities that basically give him like an energy blast, or more interesting and more unique, he has telekinesis, which he can use to fling like grenades at enemies or objects at enemies. He can also possess enemies, which in theory is cool, but it ultimately just makes you play exactly as like the point man, which is once you're possessing an enemy, you use the traditional firearms and slow motion. But it is kind of cool that once you break that psychic link with an enemy you've possessed, they explode, which is kind of cool. And I think, the notion of playing through this game in co-op when horror is not anywhere close to the priority that it was in the original, you still get a couple of creepy sightings of Alma. You get a lot of possessed or psychic characters in this that, they have these moments where they have the psychic scream and they sound like, tennis players screaming and shrieking, which is completely ridiculous and whatnot. But you can also play as him in single player once you've completed a level. So like I went back and replayed the first 3 levels after playing through him as the point man, as Paxton Fettel. That was very underwhelming. I think multiplayer co-op, whether split screen or over Xbox Live, is the preferred way to do it. But yeah, I think for me, like, while the moment to moment beats are still there, like the guns are very punchy. The guns, for the most part, the sound design behind them is great. It really needs to be studied, like the downgrade in the shotgun from the original game to the third instance, because here it's so underwhelming. Whereas the first game, like, really instilled that, okay, you're going to use a shotgun and it's going to literally turn enemies into like pink mist, especially in slow motion. Like, it's so satisfying. And rivals Max Payne in a bit in terms of like environmental destructibility, but here it's so underwhelming. But outside of that, like the other guns are pretty fun to use. I think enemy AI too, while again it feels like a bit of a downgrade from the original, is still a peg above like generic first person shooters. But for me, I just could not give less of a shit about the narrative that delves into the background between Paxton Fettel and the Point Man and all that kind of shit. It really doesn't do anything for me. But again, it's a shame that the approach to multiplayer here was introduced so late, because I think if this had been introduced in the second F.E.A.R game, that certainly had a larger audience at that point. It could have been something that was a bit more unique, but again, this studio would very quickly, I think it's Day One Studios, would very quickly be absorbed by the World of Tank Studios, I think. And so like, yeah, they went from this into that, and then it's just very clear, like the devs behind the original F.E.A.R were just like leaps and bounds ahead of where this was at.
Monolith, wasn't it?
Yeah, Monolith.
So, yeah. Yeah,
which
it says a lot, doesn't it? So
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, isn't it weird? It's like it's quite weird to think Fear 3 and Dead Space 3 kind of take the same trajectory for the series, where the horror dilutes, they introduce a co-op thing, like they both have something to do with John Carpenter, so it's this more directly, yeah. But on that, like, what do you think of like that, the whole gimmick of John Carpenter directing scenes? Do you think it made a difference? Could you notice a difference?
Honestly, I really couldn't. I don't think there's much of a difference. I think that, I don't begrudge the man at this point. If you're not going to get your payday on some of the greatest films ever made when they originally come out, and you get basically, lambasted by studios and whatnot, you should be enjoying your retirement post the ward by just slapping your name onto things and getting paid for them. But I really couldn't see anything in F.E.A.R 3 that was indicative of his involvement, to be honest. Same to be said for Toxic Commando. I think that the only thing that was surprising about F.E.A.R 3 in terms of something he could have been involved with was like the depth with which it actually delves into the narrative in terms of like establishing a backstory between, again, like I said, the Point Man and Paxton Fettel. But again, like for me, it literally doesn't do anything. I think that it more or less feels along the lines at this point of what is very run of the mill in terms of just like, yeah, there's like this backstory you didn't know about, and it's linked to like childhood trauma and the psychic dark repercussions of that kind of a thing. Like it doesn't feel that significant to me.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that they bother to delve into it, but I don't think it has the execution quite there.
Yeah, that's story written by Stephen Niles, I think, wasn't it? Who did the 30 Days of Night graphic novels. So
yes,
which makes sense like that. I mean, even though I think he was quite heavily influenced by the likes of Carpenter, in his work. So on paper it makes sense, but like not for this game. Like that's the thing. It's like both of them doing a game together makes sense, but not this one. It's a strange one. Ironically, Dead Space 3 probably would have been a better one. Like just in terms of what they were doing. But hey, that's the weird world of like getting people in to do stuff and be like, well, that was definitely worth it, wasn't it? Like, but as you said, why not? Like, get your payday where you can.
Yeah, it certainly feels indicative of like, oh, well, we are going to do this sequel that nobody asked for, so we might as well like try to make it a bit more relevant or noteworthy than just like a generic sequel. And it more or less kind of, it's always trying to put a number on things, but it more or less just feels like this kind of early 2010s 6 out of 10 shooter kind of a thing.
Yeah,
very generic, exactly what you expect. It's got a bit of flair here or there, but at the end of the day, you're kind of just like scratching your chin about how this thing really got funded the way that it did. But there's certainly worse sequels out there for third iterations.
I'm sure Paramount will be pumping lots of money into a new F.E.A.R once they
Yeah,
get hold of Warner Brothers.
yeah. But it's yeah, it was well worth trying the co-op stuff and on paper again, but I think yeah, it's a little too late, unfortunately. But um,
Alas.
yeah, alas. But you know, there's worse ways to spend 6 hours during a busy work week. But that's going to get us into your other picks for the grab bag, which are of the film variety this time.
Yeah, because initially I was going through the week and thinking, I really don't have anything I've played yet, and it's going to be a very short week otherwise. But then I just happened to be watching stuff on Tubi in the background, and ended up getting on a theme of watching like video game based films, like not based on actual video games, but like films that feature
Mm,
video game type stuff. And there were two pretty close to, I think, back to back actually, which I watched, which are about it's set in the 90s and filmed in the 90s that deal with VR like that. And yeah, it's always interesting how that ends up going, because one of those is the Lawnmower Man 2. Obviously the first film was like it's aged like milk in terms of like how it tries to represent cyberspace, but it's also just got something really, really 90s about it that's like
mm,
inescapable. And yeah, it wasn't surprising that, as video games started to become a big thing again, like they were really, with the sort of Mega Drive, SNES sort of era, we were starting to get a real like, oh, we should make a movie about this sort of thing. Now, Arcade was the film I watched, which I think first, which was also
mm,
filmed first up in 1993, which you know I watched this mainly because of the cast, because it said Seth Green was in it, and I was like, oh yeah, Seth Green in the 90s was like my spirit animal. That was fine. And John Delancey, who plays Q in Star Trek: The Next Generation,
mm,
he was also in it. I was like, okay, that's cool. So, but of course, the two people I watched it for were barely in it. So that was instead the kid from A Christmas Story was the protagonist, and obviously in his teen years, so a bit more. Yeah, I was talking to you before we were starting about this weird thing of like people who started their careers as child actors and then seeing
mm.
them in their teen years trying to be like the edgy teen. Yeah, the face was like, I know this guy. Where do I know this from? Like, yeah, sort of thing. But he's basically some like elite gamer sort of thing.
That's
So yeah, the story in this one is like, a bunch of these kids get taken. They go to this arcade called Dante's Inferno, where this mysterious man played by John Delancey is like testing out this new virtual reality game that's so amazing, and like called Arcade. Um, and yeah, basically, it if you go in the game and the thing and it catches you, it kills you. I mean, it basically feels like a ditched Nightmare on Elm Street plot, because everything about it just screams Nightmare on Elm Street, like, but
mm,
in the computers sort
yeah.
of thing. And like even the way the enemy sounds in it. But yeah, the actual stuff in it. There's a TV show here in the 90s called Nightmare,
Mm,
which basically was like a fantasy role playing thing, but they had like computer graphics, and like these kid contestants would like wear this giant helmet that goes all the way over their face so you can't see, and their teammates would then direct them around this computer world that obviously they wouldn't be able to see anyway because it's not real. But yeah, so you'd have real actors and things like there along that they'd interact with and have to. It was like doing like a Dungeons and Dragons thing, but you are basically the only guy in there, and your teammates are trying to sort of get you along and whatever, and dangers would happen. And there's a lot of that look and feel to it here, which, like I said, made me weirdly nostalgic for that kind of thing. Um, yeah, but yeah, it's like this really Windows-esque, early Windows sort of visualizer sort of nonsense going on in it. And yeah, it's a strange one, and it's always fascinating because I'd seen films, that even more recent ones, where they still treat video games like it's Mario Brothers in the 80s sort of thing,
mm,
like joysticks and jumping on things for power ups and blah blah blah. And it's like, okay, yeah, okay, sort of thing. But I don't hear it does sort of put more of a spin on that, but it just
Mm.
feels like not much actually happens in the games for a lot of it. It's just sort of there's a corridor they've kind of created in the CG thing, and of course, being early 90s CG, not done by Steven Spielberg's lot. It looks terrible, but at the same time, it's like, yeah, so you see the limitations straight away, and it doesn't really feel like much is going on. And it can't quite decide if it's is the TV the problem or is it the game that's the problem. Are video games dangerous and addictive to the point of compulsion? It sort of skirts around that and doesn't really go anywhere with it. Um, yeah, the plot is just terrible like that. But I do like that 90s sort of cyberspace thing
Mm.
aesthetic because, like I said, it's a personal nostalgia. Not I'm necessarily fond of it, but it was like weird how much it reminded me of that stuff. Yeah, of that era where it kind of looked cool then,
Mm.
but like
Yeah.
anytime you see it out of context now, it's like, ooh, yeah, like I can see that. Yeah, and there were so many programs around then that did evoke that and
Mm.
tried to suggest it. So yeah, I mean that one. I mean, we can start on that one if you want, and then
Yeah.
we'll go into Lawnmower Man 2 because there's things to say about that one beyond that. So I mean, you didn't watch
Yeah.
Arcade fully, did you? But you sort of bits and pieces.
Yeah, I didn't watch either of them fully. I kind of was just like watching bits and pieces as I got some work done, admittedly this morning, and fast forwarded through some bits. But like from what I watched of Arcade, like the opening, it's like, yeah, the narrative very much is what you said. Like there's the hotline early on, use of language that I do not condone, but it's worth repeating, I think, to give people an accurate idea of what this film amounts to outside of the visuals, which is like they go to this arcade, and I think it's Seth Green's character gets into it with like the bully, and immediately the
Yeah.
bully says something along the lines of like "Space Invaders is for retards," which kind of
Mhm.
just like more or less tells you everything you need to know about the sort of like vibe of this film.
Yeah, in
Um,
1993, they're saying Space
yeah,
Invaders. They're
right,
like, I think it's like we've moved on from there, guys.
right,
Like,
exactly, exactly. Nothing else is coming out of any note other than Space Invaders. So that's a big touch point. But I think also like it's so indicative of what is it? Full Moon Productions, I believe,
hmm,
is the production company behind this. But that's just like one of these movies that very much is indicative of their sort of like approach to productions, which is that we're going to have 85% of this film be garbage filler that is indicative not of its budget at all. And then 15% of it, you're going to be able to be like, yeah, I could see how some money could have gone towards this, which is
hmm,
very much the case here. I think once they get into the quote unquote special effects, which for me, like I'm of the age where I still remember, especially like the Saturday morning, not necessarily cartoons, but Saturday morning cartoon block in
yeah,
the States where there was always one or two live action shows that would utilize 3D graphics or computer or CGI essentially. Um, Things like Hypernauts, shows that were largely garbage, but then you got to see in the last 5 minutes of the episode like where the budget went. And this very
hmm,
much, I think, was indicative of something like that, where you get to the end portion of Arcade and like, oh, okay, cool. I see where the money went. It doesn't necessarily seem like it's been justified because of the quality of those, but it does like remind you of the type of show you might see on like I don't know, like Nickelodeon or something like that, like Hidden Temple or I suppose
hmm,
also of that era, like bowling alley animations, like the CGI is of a quality where you're just kind of like scratching your chin a little bit. But at the same time, to your point, like I don't know, I think it is touching into some nostalgia there that at least I can laugh and sort of be reflective of it. But yeah, for the
yeah.
most part, this was inexperience, to say the least.
Yeah, quite funny as well. Like, in the same week that was this I think it was Jonathan Fuller,
Mm.
who voices the arcade, the big bad monster thing that's in it.
Oh yeah.
He also showed up in a 90s film, Campfire Tales, which also was funny about the internet age of the 90s, like messaging people online. And
Mm.
like it's the story of like chatting to someone online and they're not who you think they are, sort of thing. And it's like a 12-year-old girl chatting to another 12-year-old girl. It's not a 12-year-old girl, and it was Jonathan Fuller was the guy there. I mean, he's basically like the long-haired guy in Twin Peaks sort of thing. Like, it's that creepy sort of fucking stuff. It's basically like that. As it ends up being like she thinks a dog's licking her fingers under her bed. It's him, that sort of thing. Like, it's a really creepy thing. It's like,
Oh, Lord.
It's like, it's like, so yeah, but like that whole sort of early internet of the 90s thing and chat rooms and stuff like that was like, oof, yeah, there's like two real big strange hits of nostalgia, and not in a good way, good kind of nostalgia. So, but yeah, that was an interesting one. Like I said, I watched it for certain reasons, didn't really get satisfied by those reasons, unfortunately. And I'd heard terrible things about Lawnmower Man 2, and considering people have really bad things to say about the Lawnmower Man, I thought, oh God, this must be terrible. I think it's better than the Lawnmower Man. They bring back Austin O'Brien, which is fine, but Matt Frewer is now Job, and he's, if anyone knows it, he's been in stuff like Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead. He was in Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, stuff like that. And he has a very particular style to him in terms of like that. But I found him more entertaining as like the more maniacal version of Job. But they kind of posit it as being like a near future, which is still the 90s at this point, which is like kids living in not quite slums. They're living in slums, but they've got technology enough to make their own VR headsets, sort of thing. And they're playing like VR games, and it's the fun thing about this film. I think is like it's 3 years before The Matrix, and it's doing things that film would end up doing, like, but in a really bad way, sort of thing. And it is demented, and the VR stuff is maybe a bit more. They were a bit more careful this time around, compared to the first film, where it was like, yeah, okay, we haven't really got there with the CG yet. I mean, this is 1996 by this point, so it was a little better in terms of what was there, and they don't go too crazy with it. But the whole thing of the film that actually still feels timely, I think, is the whole thing of pointing to the dangers of our information basically being in cyberspace and who can use that information, sort of thing. That is like a central plot point, and I was like, oh, that surprisingly feels relevant still, like that. And it being through having like a human algorithm going through machines and basically scouring everyone's data as they do things online. For 1996, that's like, wow, that's really ahead of it. I mean, that's, to be fair, like that's always been there in the internet, the idea of these horrors of like, oh, someone is going to con you out of all your life savings or whatever, like, and they'll know where you live. But a lot of that stuff has really not come up until the proper internet age started, and more and more people were online. But so in that sense, whereas like the Lawnmower Man felt very everything about it has aged poorly. Like it is a film that kind of came out a little too late for what it was trying to do, like, and just felt silly as a result. Like it just like didn't work. But here, at least, some of it feels fresher, feels relevant. I mean, it's the dialogue's weird. It does seem to have a script that was like they missed some pages here and there, like, and they jumped to the conclusion of what they're saying a little too quickly. I'm not saying we have to just have endless reams of exposition, but sometimes they just go, no, none. We're just I'm gonna completely understand what's happening here all of a sudden in the next line of dialogue. And the story doesn't make sense as a result of that. But like I said, it looks better than that first film, and I said it makes those strong points about the dangers of like your information on the internet. The VR side of it is limited compared to arcade, but I think looks better than that thing. And I was surprised I didn't hate this at all. I thought it was quite okay. Like not a world beater or anything, but like it was a surprise for me.
Yeah, I think for me, as somebody that I think just as recent as last year or the year before that saw the original, I was very disappointed by the lack of monkey rampages, given that that's a feature of the original and a well noted one at that. However, um, yeah, I think that for me, like with this, the fact that a sequel even exists, but when you go back and you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, actually the original one was profitable, whereas while the sequel one didn't end up being profitable, it like I don't know it speaks to an era of film that I don't think exists to the same degree that it does now, where you could have a
Mm,
movie that like it gangbusters at the box office, even if it was largely regarded as being crap. However, you could have a sequel then that even if it didn't live up to it, just the notion that you even got a sequel is like a miracle in and of itself.
yeah.
And I think that as far as this sequel goes, like it builds upon the lunacy of the original in ways that are equally insane, but there's a novelty in that. And I think that the fact that you're able to have any semblance of actual commentary be not only um, like contemporary but relevant
Yeah.
is one of those things that's like actually pretty impressive because of the fact you could say like, well, yeah, this is actually like looking ahead to the future and the potential dangers of technology and things along those lines.
Mhm.
That being said, like the opening intro when they have Job and he's in this almost like semi-vegetative state and he's in a wheelchair, and then the next scene cuts to him going through what looks like fucking NASA uh astronaut tests of him in the wheelchair, and yet they're like spinning him around in all these different ways and stuff is just like it furthermore just shows you like the insanity that's in this film. But to be fair, it's a spectacle and it has its moments of entertainment. So I
Yeah.
think that if you'd seen the original one and you could get on board with just enough of that lunacy, there's no reason that you couldn't get some laughs out of the sequel.
Yeah, and it's like whilst it's not necessarily about video games as much,
Mm,
like it was an interesting one in terms of what it was doing with that. Like I know you and me have been talking about like covering like video game adaptations and stuff like
mm,
at a point, but I also quite fascinated by that side of things, stuff like this, stuff like live scream and live screamers, like brain scan, stay alive, existence. There's such just it's a nice little sort of pool of films like that where you're like,
mm,
oh yeah, just it's nice to see how different films over the years have sort of captured what they think video games are and how they use horror in that as well.
mm.
They've all been quite different. But, yeah, there is something quite fun about that sort of experimental. We really don't have a fucking clue about what we're doing, sort of thing of the 90s, which I think Brain Scan is probably like the best example of. Where they just it works because they kind of buy into the stupidity and nuttiness of it all.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, but I mean, nothing really taps into it quite like Existence, I think.
Definitely not. No, I think Existenz is one of those movies that I have a greater appreciation for in the interim since I've watched more games about video game or movies about video games rather than one-to-one adaptations.
Hmm.
So for me, I think that that's something I definitely agree with in terms of like going back and giving some of those more of a more their due and just seeing like, yeah, they're not perfect movies, but at the same time, they seem to understand what makes a video game movie more so than some of the video game movies that are out there. So
Yeah,
yeah.
like I said, we will probably be covering stuff like that in the future. And
Mm,
in our watchings of certain ones we haven't gone through before. But we may be bringing them up here and there. Like I managed to grab myself a copy of the Galerian's Rion
mm,
anime from 2002, which proudly supports a soundtrack of pretty much my entire new metal collection in 2002. So that was a great start. But yeah, so yeah, it'd be interesting to see how some of those things that aren't Resident Evil and Silent
mm,
Hill turn out. And
yeah.
yeah, we'll definitely dabble in that as we go
Mhm.
along.
Yeah, I'm making my my list as we speak of stuff that I can start to begin to tackle slowly but surely before a lead up to when we'll get to dive into more and more of those adaptations and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, no, I think that's going to do it this week for Safe Room. And as I said at the intro, be sure, if you haven't done so, to go back and listen to last week's episode of Horror Bites, Safe Room's indie horror showcase, in which we round out our theme of aquatic horror before next week's episode of Horror Bites, which will be debuting a brand new theme where Neil and I both pick 2 games that abide by that subgenre theme and then tackle it in 2 distinctly different ways via the gameplay routes that those developers took. But yeah, until then, my friend, as always, it's a pleasure chatting horror with you for Safe Room.
Okay, my man. Until the next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's main feed episode of Safe Room. If you've enjoyed our horrifying discussions, please take a moment to rate and review the show on your preferred podcast platform, as this helps us immensely in ensuring that the show continues to grow. For any and all show updates and additional content, you can follow Safe Room on all of our socials, which are linked in the episode notes, at Safe Room Pod. And finally, you can send any and all emails to saferoompod@gmail.com. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you guys next time.